Welcome to today's episode of the Back in Shape podcast. Today's going to be a bit different if you can't already tell. We're going to be doing a book review of a book that's recently been released by Dr. Gabrielle Lyon up there in the top corner called Forever Strong. It's an absolutely awesome book. And what we wanted to start doing with some episodes of the podcast is we read a lot, etc., to inform and share with you guys who are subscribers to the podcast and members, etc., to bring you guys information that can help you maybe understand what you're doing. And this particular book is a really good one. There's some core messages that come out of here. And I'm kind of going to hopefully go through it through the lens of having a lower back injury. And I'll talk through the various bits on the board today to help give you guys, a little insight into this book. And I would recommend, we're going to be covering a lot of information that's in the first part of the book. There's tons more. It's about a 400-page book. You can get it on audio as well. But there's loads more, especially in the back half of the book. There's a lot of actionable stuff. So if you do find today's episode particularly interesting, go ahead and check it out. It's well worth a read. And I couldn't possibly cover, even a fraction of what is in the book. So the one thing I really want you to have in your mind as I'm going through today's episode is really, if you've got a lower back injury, or lower back pain, we have two things occurring. We have damage in the lower back, and invariably we have weakness that needs to be overcome in order to provide a protective layer, etc., for our back so it can go through the recovery process and so it can be stronger the other side and essentially function more effectively, increasing longevity, decreasing the risk of relapses, etc. And in order to do this, we need one important nutrient, and that is going to be protein. We'll explore as we go through that if protein is missing, we cannot possibly do these sorts of things because they are the raw materials that our bodies use. We don't survive, or we aren't built out of thin air. We are built out of building blocks, and one of the important ones, which we'll get into, maybe you didn't realize it's involved in so many of our functions and structures within the body, is going to be protein. So have that in your mind as I'm going through all of this. And I thought the first place to start is going to be with your body. All of us, we have around about 60% water. Of the remaining 40%, half of that is going to be protein. Just some of the processes and tissues that protein is going to be used in is going to be our muscles. It's going to be in our tendons and our ligaments, our connective tissue between layers. It's going to be in the bone. It's going to be in our hormones, or used to make our hormones. It's involved in detoxification, and I'm going to touch on a few of these in a moment. It's going to be in our gut absorption. We cannot function effectively if we don't have protein to make up parts of the gut, important parts. In our enzymes, all of our enzymes are going to be derived from protein. And then our immune system, as well as many other bits and pieces. And just a few of these that are worth noting. Obviously, we've got the muscle there. But from a point of view of detoxification, some of the amino acids, which we'll get into later, are used to create a molecule in our body called glutathione, which is essential for the detoxification process to take place. That's just the removal of waste. Basically, waste is joined to glutathione and then kicked out of the body. That is derived from protein, which is broken down into amino acids. As I mentioned, I'll touch on this later on. Inside our gut, inside our digestive system, we have membrane transfer proteins. They are proteins, as the name suggests, and they help transfer stuff through the gut membrane. If we don't, there's another thing that is derived from protein, or specifically, it's in the name there. We've obviously got enzymes. Enzymes basically work in our entire body, from going into your DNA and pulling some information off, putting it on RNA, then going over to another part of the cell and taking that information and putting it somewhere else, to making our digestive enzymes, to making all sorts of different processes within our body work. All of this requires protein and much, much more. And that's just scratching the surface of what was talked about. So understand that although we might commonly think, I need protein for muscle. That's a guy, a muscle-bound guy, or a power lifter, or a bodybuilder having protein shakes to build muscle. And I don't want to look like that, or I don't want to do that. Understand that protein really is used in so many areas of our body. It really is quite vital. And as we'll see a little bit later on, when we're unwell, we start to pull some of that protein, and that can really, it's something that I wasn't necessarily as intimately aware of prior to going through this book and the information in there. And it's something I think you'll be very interested to know, especially because we know some of you, when you have a relapse or when you have an illness and you're recovering from that, and then you get back into your workouts, you feel, I'm weaker. Why is that? I've lost some weight. Why is that? We'll start to understand that a little bit more here. So One of the key sections in the book is talking about more muscle and the role of muscle specifically, because we've gone through protein, and protein obviously used to make muscle tissue or support our muscle tissue, healthy muscle tissue. And if you're rebuilding your back, you're going to have to build muscle tissue. More or less all of the members in the program are looking to build muscle strength to compensate for the weaknesses in our back while it's going through a recovery process, and then build more strength so that it's less vulnerable for the long term. So we need more muscle, but some other benefits of this are really, really important. One of the big ones, which we covered a couple of weeks ago on metabolic health, was going to be its role in sugar regulation. And a simple snippet or excerpt from the book where Dr. Lyon talks about our muscles being like a suitcase. We either have a big suitcase or a small suitcase. And when we have excess sugar from a meal, the sugar is then put into that suitcase, and it needs to be stuffed into the suitcase. Now, if we've got a small suitcase, that sugar is going to then be left in the circulatory system, and that creates problems long term, especially if it's a long term issue. The more muscle tissue we have, the greater that suitcase is going to be in size, and therefore there's more places for that excess sugar to go, or the sugar that's consumed, broken down from carbohydrates, and it's just got more areas within the body that it can be stored. The second thing that was really enlightening for me was the role of insulin-independent uptake, or the role muscle has in the process of insulin-independent uptake. And I've put this down on here as a pancreas saver. And this is really looking at the fact that when we stimulate our muscles, they will pull sugar out of the circulation. So you're talking about the important role of people with obesity, diabetes, blood sugar level issues across the board. The ability to use our muscle tissue, use more of our muscle tissue as we have more to actually use, to control and help ease the burden on our pancreas, reduce the likelihood of us having things like insulin sensitivity, where our body constantly needs to jack up more insulin. Going back to that suitcase analogy, if the suitcase is full, but the system still knows there's too much sugar in circulation, it's going to keep trying to jack up the levels of insulin, and the body's going to go, well, yeah, you're telling me, there's more insulin in the system, I need to put the sugar somewhere, but there's no more places for it to go. If we are able to work that muscle tissue, so it wants to pull, because it burns through it empties its suitcase in the way of using that energy, then it's got more room to pull more sugar in. So that was a really interesting one. And some of the benefits of that can last, I think it was a day or 2 days later, in terms of increasing the active role of the muscles independent of insulin. And you can, again, go to the book to check out the nuances of that, because it's really, really interesting. And then those point 1 and 2, the suitcase sort of analogy, the space for sugar to go, and then this role of insulin independent uptake that the muscles also have in regulating our blood sugar level, which is so important. We think about that in pregnancy and gestational diabetes, and the fact that some women might be more at risk of that than others. And you will know this if you're a lady who's pregnant. You'll know maybe you've got higher risk factors that might lead, maybe family history, etc., to having gestational diabetes, which is a serious issue. The ability that we have to control this through either building more muscle ahead of time and having a greater store, or during the process of pregnancy, actually utilizing the muscle tissue we do have to help us control and manage blood sugar levels, can be really, really positive in terms of it's something you can specifically do and put into action to actually improve your health and well-being. And then we get into the really interesting one here for me, which was muscle being utilized as a resource when you are unwell. In so much as and I won't go into the details in this episode. You can read the book for more details about the amino acids and the particular ones, but she also talks about, Dr. Lyon talks about some of the amino acids that are non-essential, but they're kind of conditionally essential. So for example, when we're unwell, we're going to have a greater requirement for things like glutathione, which I touched on in detoxification, and our body's going to want to produce more of that. And that's because that is going to be involved in the immune process. We're going to be producing more white blood cells, etc., etc., etc. All of those things increase with the requirement for dietary protein. And if we're not having more dietary protein, which me being a little bit unwell from the last week or so now even, you don't tend to have the same level of appetite. Yet your body needs more in the way of protein to pull those resources, to fuel the immune system and all the processes, the enzymes, etc., back up here, that are going to be used in that. And therefore your body utilizes your muscle tissue as a reservoir for amino acids, which you can break down bits of muscle tissue to pull those out and use those in the process of recovering. She talks in detail, Dr. Lyon, about the process of cachexia, unfortunately, in horrible diseases like cancers, about Alzheimer's, dementia, and all of the roles that it can have. And there's too many to cover here. But in our muscle tissue supporting the healing and recovery process of constitutional issues. So we're not talking about back pain here, we're talking about systemic issues and our ability for, if we're unwell, to draw from that muscle tissue And therefore, the more muscle tissue we have, the more resources we have to use before we drain our muscle tissue to the point where it's a real problem. And unfortunately, when we go back to thinking about long-term back pain and we have a decrease in muscle mass, we're not very strong, we're not able to do movements like squats or hip hinges effectively. We really struggle with those because we don't have the muscular strength and control, and that's negatively affecting our back. And then we're unwell and we drain those resources of our muscle tissue even more because we're just not aware of these things. It really can start to add up. And the final sort of hitting the point home about the role of muscle in your health is that it is almost unequivocal that the more muscle tissue you have, the increased survivability you have of all diseases, illnesses, issues. The more muscle you have, the more survivability, the greater your survivability against all causes of mortality. There is literally no downside of having more muscle tissue than you currently do, let alone if we're considering we've got back pain or other issues or injuries that need to be recovered from. So that's kind of that there. And then we get onto some challenges, because one of the big things that I've seen over the years is that people have a warped understanding of protein. Often we go, well, I'm a little bit older, I don't need as much protein, or I don't need as much in the way of that sort of stuff, I don't need as much muscle, etc. But actually it's really on its head, and there are some obvious and clear disadvantages that we have as we get older. For example, as we get over the age of 40, we lose about 1% of our muscle mass a year. We use greater than that in strength. So we lose a little bit more strength every year in terms of percentage points. I think it was about 2 or 3% in some cases compared to our strength, but we are losing it every single year unless we're doing things to combat that. The other thing to bear in mind is that your body's sensitivity to protein decreases as well. Now, this is kind of obvious. We think your body's sensitivity to sound decreases with age, your body's sensitivity to light decreases with age, because the mechanisms that receive that information are degraded. Our eyes are degraded perhaps in some cases, our ears are degraded in some cases. So we need a greater stimulus to affect the same change within our body, be it hear something, see something clearly, etc. We need extra support. Now, we have no issues with going, oh, well, I'll go and get some glasses, or I'll go and get a hearing aid. Yet the notion of we actually should eat more protein on a daily basis because our body is less sensitive to it isn't something that is widely embraced. We often think, oh, well, protein, I'll let someone else have that who's a bit younger and they're doing more. But actually, you do need more as you get older because we become less sensitive to particular amino acids. And I haven't talked too much about the amino acids. I'll get onto it a little bit at the very end, but I definitely encourage you to have a look into this in more detail, because ultimately, as we get older, the requirement for these amino acids is important. We don't eat protein or eat foods for protein. We eat them for amino acids, and this is quite an important paradigm shift, and I think I'll get onto that in a moment. But just coming back to the challenges with age, obviously we also have the increased likelihood or increased frequency of getting unwell as we get older, of falls, of knocks, etc. as we get older, and therefore that's going to add to the disadvantages we have as we get older and increase the importance that we are ticking all of these boxes a little bit more so in terms of muscle mass and in terms of protein intake. So there were some interesting parts of the book towards the end, which is more about the sort of the politics, the landscape, so to speak, around protein, etc. And as I was mentioning a moment ago, one of the really interesting things was, which I hadn't really stopped to think until the book made me think it personally, was on our food labels, we have carbohydrates, and that's broken down into sugars. We have our fats broken down again on the labels, and then we just have this label which is protein. But that's very misleading, because as I said a moment ago, we eat for the amino acids that we are required to consume on a daily basis, and protein doesn't give us a full breakdown of all of those 20 amino acids. Now, 9 of those are essential to us, but we just don't have that on our food packaging. So we can't possibly understand whether we're getting appropriate quality of protein, i.e. a broad distribution of the amino acids that we need, because of those 9, we cannot make those within our body, so we must consume them from the diet. So really, a food label should ideally tell us that of the protein, there's this much of these 9 essential amino acids. The others don't really matter as much because our body can manufacture those ourselves, which is really, really cool. It's a really great feature of the body. But those 9, we have to get them from food. One of the interesting things she talks about, going back into the past, was looking at World War I and World War II. They had it was President Hoover in the latter instance actually diverting protein. He said that the meat and the fats are just as important in this war as the guns and ammunition for our soldiers. And they actually said to the American people, said, hey guys, you're going to have to forego this important resource, meat and fat, good quality meat and fat, because we need to send it to the soldiers. and you guys are going to have to subsist on the other stuff that we can grow a little bit more efficiently, grains, etc. And what was very interesting that she pointed out is 50 years later, you have people self-imposing that same restriction that was used during wartime. They knew that these foods were so rich in nutrients, rich in the things that we need to survive, that the home front, so to speak, had to go without them, so that those soldiers abroad were able to be provided appropriate nutrition. Some of the other things talks about, the first vitamins isolated in 1926, and then there's kind of subsequent to that, there's a lot of focus on trying to utilize these vitamins in fortification of cheaper foods that can be produced at larger scale. That's role in shifting a conversation away from protein and more to carbohydrates and then fats in subsequent years. I covered on the article here, the article and accompaniment to this, accompanying this podcast, a little bit about a recent diabetes study, and we see there's a lot of biased information or information that's put out so badly. And one of the comments on this particular diabetes study, which is only a couple of weeks ago that came out, a study from Harvard, and they were looking at a large population data, and it's observational data, so they get people to fill out questionnaires. I don't know about you, but I probably couldn't remember what I had for my meal yesterday with accuracy, let alone weeks or even months ago. So that's one thing to bear in mind. But they said increasing in meat consumption leads to diabetes, and in terms of the risk of increasing your diabetes, it was proportional to other information that compares drinking, I think it was 5 sodas a week. They both have the same increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. But that was how they phrased the conclusion. When you look at the data, a better way to phrase it is those in the group that smoked more, drank more alcohol, was more sedentary, had more junk food, those that didn't engage in healthy practices like exercise, etc., and were also those that ate more red meat. And therefore, and those also had more diabetes or higher instances of diabetes. When we put that laundry list together and include all of the factors that were common to the people that had more instances of diabetes, we start to see there's a different rhetoric. And you're probably, around this time, if you're interested in this sort of material, you've probably already seen references in the media to that Harvard study. And it's a way of skewing information to enact a certain sort of line of thought, when we can quite easily skew it the other way and enact a different line of thought if we're just choosing to omit certain information. So a bit of a tangent there. I wrote about it in more detail in the article that goes alongside this podcast, so definitely check that one out if you're interested. But one of the interesting things that we've been hearing over the years is, red meat and meat in general and is bad, and it increases the risk of diabetes, it increases the risk of obesity, yet by this point in the book or in the podcast, you're already thinking, well, that kind of doesn't really make sense because of all of this stuff. And meat fuels muscle, and more muscle decreases the likelihood of sugar being used inappropriately in the body. Then that kind of logically can't make sense. But we have all of that. And we do see an increase in cases of diabetes and obesity across the Western world. But one thing that's often not talked about, as Dr. Lyon talks about in the book, is the beef consumption in particular has decreased dramatically since 1970. Now, correlation is not causation, but if you've got meat consumption going like that, and you've got obesity, and you've got diabetes going like that, that kind of doesn't sound like those two things are necessarily as related as one might be led to believe, given current information that we are constantly bombarded by. So that's something that's interesting there. And a possible explanation for that, which is rather interesting, which she does lay out very nicely in the book. She talks about I think it was a 3-ounce serving of beef or of steak, and the amount of calories in there was about 132, if I remember correctly. And that was very important because that's the appropriate quality of protein to get the right amino acids for our body to function effectively, particularly with reference to building muscle tissue or muscle protein synthesis, MPS for short. And when we look at the alternatives to that from a plant-based point of view, we had quinoa. To get the same quality of protein from quinoa is perfectly possible, perfectly reasonable, but you'd have to have 670 calories versus 132 if you had the meat. For peanut butter, it was 1,000 calories to get the same quantity and quality of protein as if you were from the 3-ounce serving of meat. And then there were a couple of other examples like lentils, etc. The reason this is interesting is because as people are replacing their protein intake to get the right quantity of the right protein, they're having to consume, or at risk of consuming, substantially more calories from the plant-based sources, of much of which will often be carbohydrate as well. So that's something that's interesting, which maybe maps more closely to that increase in diabetes and obesity, but definitely, again, This is a very short overview of the book in itself, and there's tons more research, tons more information on there. So check it out to learn a little bit more. Hopefully this is just prompting things to think about going forward. So I think I'll wrap it up today for the podcast, and hopefully if you have found this sort of format interesting, sharing some of this information from the books, tying it back into what we've got from a back health point of view, then please do let us know in the comments, and we'll look to do more of these sorts of podcasts episodes as we go forward. So some final points to take home with you. Number one, we eat protein for amino acids, not for protein. And the most important thing is that protein is what makes us up. It's our body. It's how we function. Yes, vitamins, minerals, etc. All of that stuff is really important. Carbohydrates have a role, fats have a role, but protein is unequivocally there to fuel our body and the way in which it works, not just in our muscles, which is very important if we're trying to recover from an injury, thinking back to that lower back issue. But 9 of these amino acids are essential. If we're not getting them in our diet, we really are missing a trick because we're not getting the appropriate nutrition to fuel this body. And that is really, really important that we have to really get up here. Number 2 is you must get enough to trigger MPS. That's what I mentioned earlier, muscle protein synthesis. This is very relevant to you if you're trying to rebuild and restore strength in your body. For example, with reference to a back injury. We have to get enough in our system. And the particular amino acid here that is in subject is one of the 9 essentials, and that is leucine. We have to get enough of that in our servings of meat, or plant-based alternatives, to make sure that we are actually triggering muscle protein synthesis and letting it take place. Because it's a binary process. You either get enough in that instance or you do not. And if you had a bit, but it's not enough, you're not going to trigger the process. And we can be going in circles thinking, oh, I'm not making any progress with my strengthening. I'm not actually building any muscle. And then we look at our diet and go, well, I'm not actually allowing my body to be triggered to respond appropriately to the training. So it's very, very important that we start to think about these things a little bit more. I've spoken in number 3 that animal sources are going to be the greatest and easiest efficiency for this. Cue the example I mentioned a moment ago about the 3-ounce serving of steak. But animal sources are the easiest. Plant-based are perfectly fine, but you've got to manage things effectively, and it requires a little bit more legwork if you're going to be deriving this from your plant-based sources. And typically speaking, it's about 30 to 40% more in terms of a plant source of protein versus an animal source of protein in order to meet those quality criteria. Not a problem, but you've got to know this sort of thing if you're going to do that. And I think it's worth at this point just touching on the fact, as Dr. Lyon mentions in her book, this information, oh, well, you're talking a lot about meat. It's coming from an individual who spent a considerable amount of time as a vegan looking at trying to do all of these things. But food is confusing enough if we're then, for many people, or made to seem confusing enough. It's so easy to just go, boom, there's the meat, it's done. Now, there are other issues, there are environmental comments, etc., that might go into ethical choices, that might go into meat specifically, and that's perfectly fine. She covers some of those things in the book, which is very interesting as well. But just know that if you are going down a plant-based route, we need to make sure that we're getting the right amount. So you've got to pay heed to those particular numbers. The final 2 points are number 4, muscle is the organ of longevity. It's helping you recover from back pain. Know that if you are unwell, like I've been the last week or so, it's going to be being broken down whilst you're unwell to fuel some of your recovery process and the processes that needs to take place, the increased production of immune activity, etc., the rebuilding and recovering of that from that injury if it's the case of back pain. But it is the organ of longevity. The more we have, the increase or the better survivability we have to all injuries, diseases, etc. And that really is such an important point. And the final thing is building and regeneration does require protein. We've got to get it into our system, and then we have to stimulate it appropriately with the right sort of exercises to recover. So that's pretty much it. That's a review of the Forever Strong book. As I said at the very outset, it is a very concise version of what is a really, really good book and well worth a read if you have the time, or it's also available on Audible as well. Any questions? Please do post those in the comments. As I mentioned earlier, if you did find this sort of format interesting, thought-provoking, maybe it challenges some of your ideas, then please do post it in the comments as well. We'd love to hear your feedback because we're always trying to make the podcast as helpful as possible for you guys that are reading it. As always, thanks for staying to the end if you made it this far, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Back in Shape podcast.